In the burning heart of the Sahel, where the earth cracks with thirst and the sky hangs low with dust, one act of defiance split the silence. Helicopters rose not with weapons, not with fire, but with bread and beans, with milk and medicine. 10,000 bags drifting down beneath white parachutes like manna upon a land forgotten. What kind of leader risks his treasury, risks his aircraft, and risks his very life? Not to bomb, but to feed? What kind of soldier trades bullets for grain? The name is Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. And in that single choice, he turned machines of war into baskets of life, stunning his enemies and stirring his people awake. For the hungry mothers, for the barefoot children, for the fathers who had lost faith, the sky itself became their table. But listen close, because this story is not only about one nation's fight against famine, it is about the rebirth of a continent, the audacity of a young captain rewriting the rules of power. Stay with us, because this isn't just another story. It's the future our ancestors dreamed of. The air above Burkina Faso trembled with the steady thud of rotor blades. For days, villagers had hidden in huts of mud and straw, expecting only fire and thunder from the sky. But on that morning, the horizon carried something different. 10,000 sacks, heavy with maize, rice, beans, powdered milk, and medicine, were loaded onto military helicopters. Not in secrecy, not with shame, but with the solemnity of a gamble. A gamble that a hungry people, long abandoned, could be brought back to life through food rather than fear. As the machines cut across the savannah, mothers clutched their children tighter. Men whispered prayers. And then, the drops began. White parachutes burst open, flowering against the dusty sky. Burlap bags tumbled down like rain, scattering across fields and courtyards. At first, silence. Then the cries, shouts of disbelief, of joy, of raw survival. Children sprinted barefoot over cracked earth, chasing the floating gifts. Elders stretched trembling hands toward the falling bundles, as if touching a miracle. From the roofs of mud houses, women pointed and wept, calling neighbors to come. This was no bombing raid. This was no show of power through fire. It was power through compassion, for Captain Ibrahim Traoré had chosen to turn the battlefield upside down. Where others dropped explosives, he dropped sustenance. Where others spread terror, he spread grain. And the savannah, long haunted by hunger, erupted with something it had not known in years: hope. Word spread faster than the wind. From village to village, across rebel lines, across the borderlands, the story carried. Helicopters of the state have fed us. Not the rebels, not the foreigners, but the government in Ouagadougou itself. And yet, this was no act of simple charity. It was theater, but theater with purpose. Every parachute was a signal. Every sack of rice a message. Every drop a declaration that the people were not forgotten. Across Africa, young men shared videos on their phones, parachutes blossoming above parched fields. Captions read, "This is leadership." Elders sitting beneath baobab trees whispered, "Perhaps the nation has found a leader who remembers us." Critics called it reckless. Observers called it extravagant. But to the barefoot child clutching a sack of beans, it was salvation. And to Traoré, it was something more. It was strategy. Because in that gamble, he placed his future, his government's survival, and his nation's fragile unity upon the wings of helicopters. And as the world watched, one phrase began to echo through headlines, broadcasts, and whispers alike. Captain Ibrahim, latest news. Not about weapons, not about defeat, but about a leader who dared to feed. And so the gamble in the skies was cast. A throw of dice upon the dusty savannah, a move so daring that both allies and enemies stood frozen, wondering, could bread truly fight bullets? Could grain win where guns had failed? Only time would answer. But for the starving villagers of Burkina Faso, the answer had already fallen from the sky. For years, rebellion in Burkina Faso had not thrived on rifles alone. Its sharpest weapon was hunger. Rebels controlled roads. They blocked markets, rationed grain, taxed salt and sugar. They promised survival in exchange for obedience, forcing villagers into submission not by bullets, but by empty stomachs. And in every village where a mother skipped her own meal so a child could eat, rebellion grew stronger, not weaker. Captain Ibrahim Traoré saw this truth clearly. He understood that guns were loud, but hunger was silent, and silence could kill faster than any bullet. If starvation continued, no government decree, no soldiers' patrol, no flag raised in Ouagadougou would matter, because a starving people belong to whoever feeds them. And so he acted. With helicopters, with parachutes, with burlap sacks bursting open on scorched earth. Food became his counterattack. Beans instead of bullets, milk instead of missiles, rice instead of rockets. This was not mercy. It was strategy, raw, precise, dangerous. Villagers, once forced to rely on rebel rations, now saw another hand feeding them, the hand of the state. And in that moment, loyalty began to shift. The very root of rebel power, desperation, was severed. Around the fires at night, families whispered, "If the government feeds us, why obey rebels who starve us?" Children who once learned to fear the sound of helicopters now ran toward them, laughing, chasing the white blossoms of parachutes. The narrative had changed, but change came with risk. What if rebels seized the food? What if they claimed credit for the drops? What if villagers saw only spectacle, not salvation? Traoré anticipated this. He scattered supplies widely so no single group could hoard them. He ordered radio stations to broadcast the message. These gifts are from your government, from your country, not from rebels, not from foreigners. And the people listened. They saw the seal of the state stamped upon the sacks. They remembered whose helicopters had braved rebel skies. And slowly, quietly, they began to resist rebel control, hiding food, sharing it in secret, even refusing to pay taxes demanded by insurgents. Across the Sahel, observers marveled. Could bread undo fear? Could food outmaneuver the gun? International voices called it reckless, too costly for a fragile nation. But Traoré countered with a blunt truth. The cost of doing nothing is greater. Hunger will recruit more rebels than poverty ever could. And so the drops continued. Each descent of a parachute was more than a delivery. It was a silent vote, a choice between famine and dignity, between coercion and compassion. The battlefield itself was shifting. No firefight, no casualties. Yet loyalty was detonating, exploding silently within hearts long hardened by despair. And in the echo of rotor blades, a question rose across the savannah. Could a nation be won back not with steel, but with sustenance? Traoré wagered yes, and in every hungry mouth fed, in every trembling hand clutching a sack of maize, his gamble was proving true. Hunger had been the rebels' sharpest weapon. Now it was slipping from their grasp. Bread in its plainest form is nourishment, but in the hands of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, bread became politics. Every sack tumbling from the sky was more than calories. It was a banner. It was a declaration. Your government remembers you. And in that, Traoré discovered a truth older than war itself, that the politics of bread can shape the destiny of nations. For decades, Burkina Faso had been told that legitimacy flowed from foreign aid, from donor conferences in Paris, from military alliances signed in silence. But Traoré turned that notion upside down. Legitimacy, he argued, flowed from feeding your people when they were hungry. It flowed from the mother cooking rice for her children, whispering thanks not to rebels, not to foreigners, but to her own state. And so while critics in Ouagadougou fretted about the $20 million spent on this audacious operation, Traoré framed it differently. How many million, he asked, have we buried in weapons? How many millions have purchased nothing but graves? At least these millions have bought us loyalty. For in politics, loyalty is priceless. And loyalty once lost cannot be purchased back with treaties or tanks. It must be earned with sacrifice. The brilliance of the food drops lay not in their logistics, but in their symbolism. Parachutes blossoming in the sky became emblems of abundance, defying the rebel narrative that the state was weak, absent, or uncaring. When villagers saw sacks stamped with the seal of Burkina Faso, they saw more than food. They saw proof that their nation still lived. And this proof spread like wildfire. In markets of Ghana, in cafes of Bamako, in WhatsApp groups from Dakar to Nairobi, images of raining food went viral. Young Africans typed captions. This is the leadership we need. Old men remembering days of famine nodded in agreement. This is how a leader wins hearts. But politics is never without cost. Opposition figures in parliament accused Traoré of extravagance. Economists warned of inflation. Western advisors scoffed at what they called a stunt. Yet the murmurs of gratitude rising from villages carried more weight than the polished critiques of city elites. Because in those villages, the politics of bread was undeniable. Rebels offered hunger. The government offered food. And for the first time in years, the balance tipped. Families painted Traoré on their mud walls. Children sang songs of the parachutes. Markets once dead began to breathe again as surplus aid sparked trade. The politics of bread had become a weapon sharper than guns. A propaganda not written on posters, but tasted in the mouth, smelled in the cooking pot, shared across families. And so Traoré understood. Victory was not won in battlefields alone. Victory was won in kitchens, in fires where mothers boiled maize and whispered to their children, "Your government feeds you." For bread was not only survival, it was dignity, it was belonging. And in a land where famine had long been used to bend backs and break wills, the politics of bread was a revolution. And now I ask you, dear listener, if you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. The drops did not end in Burkina Faso. Their echoes rolled across borders, over deserts, through whispers in palaces and markets alike. In Bamako, in Niamey, in N'Djamena, generals watched footage of helicopters scattering food. They had sent their own aircraft into rebel zones for years, but always with bullets, never with bread. Now they asked themselves, what would happen if we fed instead of fought? The question was dangerous, for it challenged decades of doctrine. Western powers armed African armies with rifles, drones, and debt, never with grain. Aid was given through convoys guarded by foreign flags, never by the sovereign hands of African states themselves. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré had shattered the taboo. He proved that a small nation, bruised and battered, could defy convention. He proved that Burkina Faso latest news was no longer about crisis, but about courage. From Mali to Niger, young activists cheered. They saw in Traoré not only a president, but a symbol, a leader daring to claim that sovereignty means feeding your own, without begging from Paris or Washington. From Ghana to Senegal, students debated in cafes. If Burkina Faso can do this, why not us? And at the African Union, whispers turned into conversations. Could food be used not just as aid, but as strategy? Could the fight against hunger be the foundation of continental power? The reverberations unsettled many. Foreign diplomats feared a contagion of defiance. If Burkina Faso could reclaim its gold mines, tax its telecom giants, and feed its poor, what would stop other Sahel states from breaking free of the donor's leash? What would stop Africa from saying, we will no longer kneel, we will no longer beg? Yet among the people, the effect was electric. Images of parachutes became icons. Murals appeared on city walls. Folk songs carried the story into distant villages. Children played games, tossing cloth bags and shouting Traoré. The spectacle had become myth. But myths too are weapons. And this myth traveled faster than any convoy, faster than any propaganda. It traveled by phone, by song, by hope. It told Africans that leadership could mean more than treaties, more than empty speeches. It could mean feeding the hungry at whatever cost. In quiet rooms, Sahel ministers debated grain reserves, irrigation projects, and regional food packs. Traoré had planted a seed of possibility, that Africa might feed itself, protect itself, and redefine power on its own terms. And so the reverberations were not merely about Burkina Faso, they were about the continent itself. For when food rained upon rebel lands, it rained also upon the imagination of Africa. It suggested a different tomorrow, one where sovereignty was measured not in borrowed dollars, but in the ability to nourish your people. Thus the continental awakening had begun, not in grand declarations, not in boardrooms, but in the simple act of rice tumbling from the sky. No gamble is without risk. And Traoré's gamble, 10,000 sacks of food hurled across hostile skies, was as perilous as any battle. Advisors warned him. The helicopters could be shot down. The sacks could be seized by rebels. The treasury could collapse under the weight of $20 million spent on grain and fuel. Even allies whispered that the plan bordered on madness. Yet Traoré did not retreat. He knew the greater risk was in doing nothing. Because famine recruits more soldiers than ideology ever could. Because when the state fails to feed its people, rebellion will always rise to claim the role of provider. So he chose risk over surrender, but he chose it with calculation. Supplies were scattered unpredictably, so no warlord could hoard them. Local radio proclaimed, "These gifts are from your government, not from rebels." Villagers defended the drops, hiding food, resisting looters, spreading the truth. Still, the costs were staggering. Economists in Ouagadougou calculated the price of procurement, packaging, flight hours, maintenance. $20 million for a single operation, a fortune for a fragile state. Critics cried extravagance. Western advisors sneered, unsustainable. But Traoré reframed the numbers. How much, he asked, does war cost? How much does displacement cost? How much does surrendering our people to hunger cost? Better to burn millions on food than to bury our future in graves. Beyond the risk, there was vision. The drops were not only about feeding for a day, they were a rehearsal for something greater. Traoré redirected revenues from reclaimed gold mines once owned by foreign corporations. He taxed multinational telecom giants more aggressively. He began sketching plans for joint Sahel food reserves, arguing to neighbors that famine was not merely a humanitarian issue, but a security threat as grave as guns. Behind closed doors, he told his advisors, "Feeding our people is the first step to feeding Africa. Once we master supply from the sky, no blockade, no embargo, no border can stop us." Thus, the spectacle of falling grain became a Trojan horse. On the surface, it was relief. In truth, it was training for logistics, for economic resilience, for sovereignty. And the people felt it. Fathers returned to farming, no longer fleeing from famine. Markets revived, trade flickered back to life. Villagers whispered gratitude not to foreign donors, but to their own government. The risks had been real. The costs had been crushing. But the returns, loyalty, dignity, sovereignty were priceless. For in a land where hunger had long been used as a weapon, Captain Ibrahim Traoré had dared to wield compassion as a sword. And in doing so, he unveiled a larger vision, that the fight for Africa's future would not be won in foreign boardrooms, nor in the arsenals of great powers, but in the kitchens of its own people. Thus, the gamble was more than an operation. It was a lesson, a warning to enemies, a promise to allies, and a blueprint for generations. As the sun dipped low over the savannah, fires glowed in the villages. Pots of rice and beans, drawn from parachuted sacks, simmered with a fragrance long forgotten. Children laughed as they ate. Mothers wept softly with relief. Fathers, for the first time in years, spoke of tomorrow not with dread, but with hope. And so the story of helicopters raining food was not just about survival. It was about legitimacy, about sovereignty, about daring to believe that Africa could chart its own path. In those sacks of maize and milk lay more than sustenance. They carried dignity. They carried proof that leadership could mean more than war or debt. For the Captain Ibrahim, latest news was not of defeat, but of defiance. Not of surrender, but of sovereignty. He had turned food into a weapon sharper than fear, compassion into a shield stronger than steel. And the echoes of that gamble rolled far beyond Burkina Faso, inspiring whispers from Mali to Niger, unsettling boardrooms in Paris and Washington. In markets, in schools, in distant camps, the word spread. The government fed us. The rebels did not. And that memory cannot be erased. Yes, the cost was heavy. Yes, the risks were vast. But the return was priceless. Loyalty, trust, and the faint but steady glow of rebirth. So when you hear Burkina Faso latest news, remember not only the hunger, not only the war, but the moment a young captain gambled everything on compassion and won the hearts of his people. The Captain Ibrahim latest news is this. He showed that in the 21st century, Africa's battles are not only against bullets, but against despair. And sometimes victory arrives not in tanks or treaties, but in a sack of rice falling gently from the sky. Africa rise. If this story moves something in your chest, like, share, speak, subscribe, because they hid our history long enough. Let's just speak our future out loud.